We don't raise excuses in this house, my father said, staring straight through me like I'd already vanished. It wasn't some grand scandal. There were no headlines, no tribunals, no flaming disgrace. Just a system error, a line of broken code that flagged my military clearance as suspended. 2 hours later, it was cleared. But by then, the damage was done. Not by the army, not by command, but by the people who claimed to love me most. My family didn't wait to ask what happened. They didn't call. They didn't ask if I was okay. When I got home that night, boots still caked in dust jacket, stiff from sweat and sand, the porch light was off. The locks had been changed, and there by the door was a duffel bag. No note, no warning, just the bag zipped tight with everything I owned stuffed inside, like the past 12 years had been an inconvenience they were finally rid of. I didn't knock. I stood there a while staring at the same door I used to come through every Sunday for dinner. The door where my mum would leave little seasonal wreaths or tape up homemade signs when one of us had a birthday. That door was dark now, final, like a sealed vault. Eventually, it creaked open. My father, Major Nathaniel Monroe, retired, stepped into the doorway. Back straight, shirt tucked so sharp it could have cut. The kind of posture you can't unlearn even after leaving the service. I opened my mouth, and before I could get a full sentence out, he said it. We don't raise excuses in this house. Just like that. Like I'd stolen something sacred. Like I was dirt on the family name. It wasn't an excuse, I said, keeping my voice calm even though my throat burned. It was a glitch. Tech team verified it. It's already been. It doesn't matter. His voice was tight. Controlled. Your name showed up flagged. That stain sticks. He gestured toward the bag with the kind of finality that doesn't need punctuation. Take your things. I looked past him into the house. Caleb, my younger brother, sat at the dining table, arms folded. Chicken and rice sat untouched on his plate. He stared ahead deliberately, not seeing me. My mother Teresa stood at the sink, hands on the faucet, like she needed something to hold her up. Caleb, I said. Just his name. A whisper, almost. He didn't blink. Mum. She didn't turn. She didn't speak. She just kept her eyes on the dishes. I don't even think she was washing anything. Can we talk? I tried again. Just the three of us. We've seen the report my father cut in. We know what matters. It was fixed. There was no misconduct. You embarrassed us, he snapped. That stung. Not because it was harsh, but because it was familiar. I'd heard versions of it my whole life. I was the one who spoke up. Too much questioned. Authority didn't fall in line the way Caleb did. When I chose combat logistics over medicine, like my dad wanted, he said I was throwing away my potential. When I cut my hair short in college, my mum said, "Why make yourself harder to love?" This was just a louder echo of everything they'd whispered for years. Still, something in me hoped for one last olive branch, even a brittle one. You think I'd come home if I was guilty, I asked. You think I'd show my face if I'd done anything wrong? My father didn't answer. He just turned and walked back inside, left the door open behind him like I was a draft that needed to be shut out. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was a wall, a door, a verdict. I bent down, picked up the bag. The zipper snagged on the fabric, and for a second I almost ripped it in frustration. But I didn't. I just stood there, hand on the strap, staring at the house, hoping Caleb would get up, hoping Mum would look. Anything. But they didn't move. The only sound was the faint hum of the kitchen light above them. I walked away. Slowly. Deliberately. Not because I was in shock, but because I was taking it all in. The porch, the yard, the air. Everything I used to call home now smelled sterile. Like something already dead. At the corner of the street, I looked back one last time. Caleb was at the window, barely visible through the blinds. We locked eyes for maybe 2 seconds. He looked away first. I made it to the bus station by midnight, slept on a bench with my knees tucked to my chest and my bag as a pillow. I didn't cry. Not that night. Not even when the ticket agent asked one-way or round trip and I couldn't answer. The tears came later somewhere between Amarillo and Pueblo as the wheels hummed beneath me, and a child in the next row laughed at something on a tablet. I looked out the window, my reflection dark and smudged by the night. They erased me, I whispered before they even asked who I was. That's the part that still cuts. Not the exile, not the loss, but the silence. The silence said it all. They didn't want my side. They didn't even want to know it. They had already decided the version of me that mattered no longer existed, and maybe that hurt more than anything else could have. So, I erased her too, not out of spite, but survival. I left town without saying a word. No goodbye texts, no calls to old friends. Just vanished. The kind of vanishing that isn't loud or dramatic, it's surgical. The kind where you take the long way to the bus station so no one sees you go. I chopped my hair in a cheap motel bathroom just outside El Paso. The scissors were dull and the mirror was cracked. It didn't matter. I needed something gone. I watched the strands fall into the sink like dead leaves. That night, I wrote down a new name, Emily Rhodes, on the back of a gum wrapper. Not because I liked it, just because it didn't belong to her. Evelyn Monroe was too heavy to carry across state lines. Colorado felt anonymous, big enough to disappear and quiet enough to breathe. I worked the graveyard shift at a gas station where the coffee was burned and the windows never quite got clean. I bussed tables at a 24-hour diner with sticky menus and a manager who called everyone kid no matter how old they were. I cleaned motel rooms for tourists who never made eye contact. Every job was a little humiliation and a little freedom. No one expected me to be impressive. No one expected me to be anything at all. And that made it bearable. At night in the shoebox apartment, I rented behind a liquor store. I'd take out my old military notebook, the one I used to keep tucked into my back pocket during drills. Pages full of field strategies, cool signs, my own scribbles in the margins, things I thought would matter forever. I stared at it for weeks, not knowing what I was waiting for, until one night, when the sky hung low with snow and everything felt still. I stood outside behind the building, crouched by a dented trash can, and lit the first page. The paper curled into black within seconds. It smelled like old metal and gasoline. I fed in the rest of the notebook, slowly, page by page, like a ritual. My fingers trembled, but not from fear. It felt like clarity. When the last page turned to ash, I whispered to the flames I wasn't failing. I was stepping off their stage, and for the first time in a long time, I meant it. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even heartbroken. I was just done performing, done proving, done trying to fit inside the outline of someone else's daughter. Disappearing didn't mean I was lost. It meant I had room to rebuild, quietly, on my own terms. But that quiet wasn't always kind. Some nights it turned on me like an echo with teeth. I'd walk home from the diner with the smell of grease clinging to my clothes, my hands chapped from dish soap, and wonder if this was all I'd ever be, now just another body in a hairnet wiping down tables. There were moments, usually just before dawn, when the world hadn't yet decided who it wanted me to be, where I'd almost forget my own name. Not Evelyn, not Emily, just nothing. A breath in a borrowed life. Once, during a double shift, a kid dropped a plate of pancakes and burst into tears. The manager snapped at her. I didn't say anything. I just picked up the plate and started cleaning. But that night, I wrote her name down in my journal. Not because she mattered to the plot of my life, but because I needed something to matter, even if it was just a scared child and a mess. Emily Rhodes became a story I was telling myself. A name with no history, no weight. She didn't have to be exceptional. She just had to survive. I started building tiny rituals, things that reminded me I was still real. I'd buy a blueberry muffin every Friday from the gas station, even though it was stale. I'd watch the same old war documentaries late at night, mouthing the tactics under my breath like prayers. I even began fixing things around the building. Broken fences, flickering lights, not because anyone asked, but because solving problems made me feel useful again. That's the thing no one tells you about vanishing. It's not just leaving people behind. It's leaving behind the version of yourself who always needed to be seen. I wasn't running. I was untethering, bit by bit, from the weight of my father's standards, from the shame my mother wore like perfume, from the silence Caleb hid behind. I didn't miss them. Not really. What I missed, what I mourned, was the girl who still thought they might one day come looking. But no one came. And once I accepted that, I stopped waiting and started building. Not a new life exactly, but a quieter version of one. I picked up shifts when no one else wanted them, took night classes in strategic planning through a local college extension program, signing up under the name Emily Rhodes. It felt strange at first, learning systems I once taught, reviewing logistics I could recite in my sleep. But it grounded me, made me feel like the past hadn't been wasted, just repurposed. The professor called me Ms. Rhodes, and I never corrected her. No one in class knew I'd once briefed commanders. No one needed to. At the gas station, people started asking me for help with more than just gas or smokes, directions, broken taillights, sometimes just company while their car idled. I became reliable without needing to be remarkable. One afternoon, a woman rushed in holding a toddler and a torn manila envelope. Her hands shook. Her English was clipped and desperate. She asked if we had a fax machine. I pointed to the corner, but when I saw her eyes, I knew something was wrong. She was trying to submit documents for a hearing immigration last chance. The system had jammed and she was out of time. I didn't think. I grabbed the envelope, ran to the diner across the lot, begged to use their ancient scanner. We got it through. Barely. She cried like I'd given her a passport to breathe. That night, I found her name tucked in the corner of the fax slip Marisol. I never saw her again, but I never forgot. That moment cracked something open. The next week, I volunteered at a local shelter that offered translation and advocacy support. No one asked for credentials. They just needed people who showed up. I learned to write grant letters, to navigate public databases, to advocate through paperwork silent armor. I wasn't in uniform, but I was in service. I wasn't saluted, but I was trusted. There's a kind of power in anonymity. When no one expects you to be useful, every small act becomes revolutionary. I didn't need a title. I didn't need applause. I just needed to know that even if my family had discarded me, I could still make myself necessary to someone. Some people create value by standing in the spotlight. I was learning how to build mine in the dark. Nights became my rhythm. The world was quieter, then emptier, but somehow more honest. I'd walk home past rows of shuttered storefronts, the neon signs still buzzing like they didn't know how to rest. In those hours, no one cared who I had been. I was just the woman in a navy jacket who always carried a flashlight, who stopped to help a man gather his spilled groceries or fix the broken latch on the shelter's door. I started keeping a small notebook, not military issue, just something from a dollar store. I logged every tiny thing I helped with. Not for credit, for proof, not for them, for me. Because when you've been erased, you begin to question if you ever left a mark at all. One entry simply read, "Helped Mrs. Tenner install a space heater." She cried because no one had touched her thermostat in 3 winters. Another translated a benefits form for Jamal's mum. She kissed my hand. I didn't know what to do. I didn't speak Spanish fluently, but I learned fast out of necessity, out of care. I kept a battered copy of a beginner's dictionary in my coat pocket. The cover peeled, the corners curled. But it felt like carrying a bridge. The shelter printed badges for us volunteers, thin plastic rectangles, with names typed on printer labels and covered in Scotch tape. Mine said, Emily R., but the R had started to fade. I never replaced it. I liked that it was coming undone. Like me, it existed halfway real, but worn, fragile, but still functioning. Sometimes, late at night, I'd hold that badge in my hand and think, this is the only name anyone has said to me in weeks. I thought that would feel empty, but somehow it didn't. It felt earned. And when the shelter director asked if I wanted to apply for a coordinator role, I smiled and said no. I wasn't ready to lead again. Not yet. I just wanted to keep showing up, keep being useful, quietly, consistently. That was the thing I had never known how to be consistent. In the army, I was sharp, aggressive, ambitious. At home, I was the rebellion no one wanted. But here, I was a thread that held things together. Not flashy, just strong. I started staying later, fixing the printer when it jammed, bringing coffee when someone looked tired, sitting with people who were too scared to fill out forms alone. And when I left each night, walking past the flickering street lamp that never quite stayed on, I'd whisper to myself, they don't have to know your name, just keep the light on. Because sometimes, maybe most times, the most valuable people are the ones nobody claps for. The ones who sweep the floor after the parade has ended. And I was starting to believe that was enough. The ones who sweep the floor after the parade has ended. And I was starting to believe that was enough. But life has a strange way of circling back to the very things you thought you'd buried. It wasn't dramatic. No spotlight, just a flyer on a community board seeking logistics consultants for National Emergency Response Project, military background preferred. I took it down, folded it into my coat pocket, and carried it around for 2 weeks before calling. The man on the other end asked basic questions. Availability schedule, comfort with data. No one asked for my rank. No one cared about my dishonour because officially there wasn't one. You'll start remote, he said. Think tanks are better quiet anyway. That's how it began. I worked under the name E. Rhodes, reviewing supply chains for flood response and wildfire coordination. What started as a temp role turned into 3 months, then 6. By the time they flew me to DC, I was already handling half the back end for a mobile command hub out west. They didn't know my history. They just saw results. I was precise, efficient, invisible in the best way. There's a phrase I read once, when you no longer need credit, your power multiplies. That became my code. I wasn't there to be seen. I was there to make systems work. Quiet systems save lives. I found myself in rooms filled with brass and suits, all of them looking for the loudest voice. But I learned to speak through outcomes. When a supply route collapsed in New Mexico, I rerouted convoys overnight, using infrastructure maps I'd memorized in a past life. When a comms unit failed mid-rescue, I deployed an alternate relay using a workaround I'd built out of nothing but cheap satellites and weather data. People started asking for me, not by name, but by position. Get the Rhodes strategist. Check with ER first. No one knew who I was. No one knew I'd once been Evelyn Monroe court-martialed in the court of her own kitchen. And that anonymity was armour. They saw me as reliable. I let them. I even shaved a few years off my resume to keep the cover clean. I became a myth in the chain of command, a ghost, with perfect timing. I didn't need a chair at the head of the table. I just needed to be at the table when it mattered. After one operation, a mid-ranking analyst patted me on the back and said, "No offence, but I assumed you were just another intern until your routing diagram saved the evac op." I smiled. None taken. I didn't correct him. That was the gift of reinvention. No one could shrink what they couldn't see coming. The funny part: the higher I rose, the less I wanted the view. I kept my apartment in Colorado, still volunteered when I could, still paid in cash sometimes. I never took interviews, never signed my real name. I didn't need headlines. I had clarity. For the first time in years, I wasn't running or hiding. I was leading, just quietly, like a current beneath still water. But there were moments, brief and brittle, where I felt the old shape of myself trying to breathe again. Late nights alone in the operations room, I'd catch my reflection in the darkened glass headset on posture hunched over data feeds, and I'd think, you look like her. The girl who thought clarity was permission. But it wasn't nostalgia. It was calibration. Every time a mission slipped toward chaos, I knew how to see the pattern before it broke. During one particularly tense operation, we lost satellite feed over a key drop zone in southern Syria. No one could confirm the evac route. I ran a recalibration using outdated topographical maps I'd saved on a thumb drive no one knew I carried. The field commander barked, "We're blind out here," and I patched in an alternate line through a weather drone's low-res camera. We got everyone out, no casualties, no applause. Just a single email from a commander I'd never met. "Who the hell is ER?" I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The next day, I found a note on my desk written in permanent marker, "When all else fails, ask the ghost." I smiled. Not because it flattered me, but because it confirmed something I'd always suspected: influence doesn't require presence. Sometimes, the most powerful person in the room is the one whose name isn't spoken, only needed. There's a strange grace in being underestimated. You get to see people clearly, their ambition, their fear, their reliance on titles. I watched new recruits stumble over their need to be seen, and I felt compassion, not superiority, just a quiet knowing I'd already bled for that lesson. I didn't envy their shine. I envied their innocence. I kept everything minimal, no desk photos, no memorabilia. The only thing personal in my workspace was a folded map tucked into my notebook. Not of a country, not even a battle zone, just the ridgelines around my apartment in Colorado, lines I'd memorized from walking them at night when my mind felt too crowded. They reminded me where I came from, who I became when no one was looking. One morning, a senior logistics officer leaned over during a staff briefing and whispered, "You know, you've been quietly running this entire section for 6 months, right?" I didn't answer, just kept taking notes. The truth was, I knew. I knew exactly how far I'd come, not despite being erased, but because of it. Being invisible had taught me precision, restraint, power without the need to be crowned. The irony. Every new mission brought me closer to the one place I thought I'd lost forever, the battlefield. But this time I wasn't carrying a weapon. I was directing the pieces. I became known as the contingency mind, the one who always had a plan D when A through C burned. They offered me titles. I turned them down. "Call me Rhodes," I said. "That's enough." Because names can be prisons, and I was finally free, which made it strangely fitting when the mission came no rank, no briefing photo, no formal chain of command. Just a single encrypted message routed through 3 layers of authorization. "You've been selected for Task Echo. Coordinates to follow." It didn't say my name, just EM. That's all they needed. That's all I wanted. The assignment was buried so deep I wasn't even allowed to bring a cell phone. They flew me out of DC under a logistics visa, routed me through a civilian base in Germany, and then into the sandstorm of what I only knew as the Quadrant. No flag, no badge, just a binder full of satellite photos and a situation so tangled it made my lungs tighten. A team of embedded medics had gone dark during an unauthorized cross-border relief mission, some kind of rogue aid operation, that fell apart when the conflict line shifted. Civilians were trapped. Terrain was unstable. Communications had collapsed. The military couldn't officially get involved. Too many jurisdictions, too much red tape. But if someone could quietly orchestrate an extraction without drawing attention, they'd be listening. That someone was me. I built a plan out of shadows. We used commercial cargo trucks, painted like food delivery, old oil routes from a forgotten pipeline system, and a convoy of battered local jeeps that could disappear into the heat shimmer. I named it Operation Threadbare, not because it was weak, but because it had to be almost invisible to work. 3 days of dry planning. One sleepless night staring at maps scrawled over with red marker like veins on a battlefield. I used no digital files, just paper tape and a compass. The final plan looked like a child's drawing on desert parchment. But it worked. We got them out. Every single one. No gunfire, no bloodshed. Just whispers over static and trucks that never stopped moving. When the last team cleared the danger zone, a voice cracked over the comms. Who coordinated this? Who's leading command? The response came from the field sergeant I trusted most. Codename EM. No further details. I sat in the darkened tent, the wind lifting the canvas walls like breath. And for the first time in years, I let myself feel it. Not pride, exactly, but certainty. I had done something impossible, and no one would ever know it was me. There's a strange holiness to that. When we returned to base, there were no medals, just nods, a single hand-squeezed shoulder, and a folded map returned to me marked with a circle and one word, safe. That was enough. I tucked the map into my bag. Later alone, I flattened it on my bunk and traced the red lines with my finger. All those twists and pivots, all those tiny decisions, each one leading to a life saved. It didn't need my name scrawled on the bottom. That map was my legacy, a red-inked artifact of a war fought without headlines. That night, I burned the last official document bearing my old name. Watched the edges curl, turn to smoke. No bitterness, no anger, just release. Rhodes was no longer a disguise. It was a choice, an identity built from action, not ancestry. And I knew now I didn't have to be remembered to matter. Still, the silence that followed was deafening in its own way. Not because I wanted recognition, but because I'd just proven that even ghosts can move armies. And no one would ever say my name. That night, the desert was unusually still. I stood outside the tent, watching a crescent moon hang low over the ridgeline. My boots left shallow impressions in the sand, but the wind erased them almost instantly. It felt fitting. I opened my field binder one last time, flipping past the folded maps. The hand-scrawled timetables, the satellite printouts faded at the edges. On the back of the final page, I drew a single line in red ink, one continuous sweep from point A to point safe. No labels, no names, just the arc of movement that had saved 36 lives. That was the only record I kept. I tucked it away between my shirt and skin like armor. There were briefings the next morning, the kind where everyone speaks in code and no one makes eye contact too long. One of the newer analysts, barely out of grad school, handed me a report and said, "You saved them, whoever you are." I gave him a small nod. Didn't speak. What would I say? I'm the girl whose family changed the locks before hearing the truth. No. That wasn't who I was anymore. Rhodes wasn't a cover. She was the evolution, the version of me that no longer needed an audience to be effective. Later, back in DC, I returned the binder to the archive team without a word. Protocol, everything confidential, everything sealed. But the archivist, a greying woman with sharp eyes, looked up and said, "You've got steady hands. That kind of planning only comes from someone who's seen chaos." It wasn't a question. I didn't answer. just gave a short nod and walked out. I kept thinking about the moment in the mission when everything could have gone wrong, the first checkpoint, when one of the trucks stalled and we had to push it uphill in the dark with no headlights, no engine, just sweat and silence. A local boy, maybe 12, jumped in to help us barefoot and grinning like this was a game. I gave him my backup flashlight when we reached the edge of the safe zone. He beamed like I'd handed him gold. I'll never forget that face, because that boy had no idea who I was or what I'd done to earn that role. And he didn't care. All he knew was that someone showed up and got them out. That was enough. That was everything. Later, during debrief, I was asked if I wanted to attach a signature to the strategy log. Initials, the officer asked. Most of the other contractors add a tag. I paused for half a beat. Just leave it blank, I said. If they need me, they'll find me. And they would. That much I knew. I wasn't chasing closure anymore. I was building something better than reputation. I was building trust in the quietest form action with no invoice. And in a world full of people screaming for attention that was revolutionary. Which is why it felt almost cruelly ironic when the world turned to look at me again on someone else's stage. Caleb's ceremony was supposed to be internal. Just another commendation for a rising officer with the right surname, the right record, the right timing. I wasn't invited, of course. I wasn't even supposed to be on base, but I'd been called in for a private strategy consult the day before, just a favour to an old analyst who didn't know my full name, just the initials. When I saw the poster outside the hall honouring Captain Caleb Monroe Service Loyalty Legacy, I froze. Not because I wanted to be part of it, but because my stomach did that familiar drop like a memory you don't want resurfaces too fast. I almost walked away. I really did. But something, a pulse, maybe stubbornness, kept my boots rooted. So I stood at the very back of the hall in uniform, but without insignia, arms crossed, eyes low. I just wanted to witness, nothing more. The room was packed. My mother sat front row in a navy dress with a small gold pin I recognised from my father's old jacket. Caleb stood at the podium, handsome and polished, his voice clear. I barely recognised him. It had been over a decade, the same jawline but sharper, a confidence that curled at the corners like it had been practised. I caught pieces of his speech. Teamwork. Honour the name we carry, those who guided me. My name was not among them. That much was clear. But then something happened. The commanding officer, a man I'd never met, stepped up to close the ceremony. He scanned the crowd with the ease of someone used to being obeyed, and then he paused. Just for a second. Then again. Longer. His gaze locked with mine from across the room, and in a voice that suddenly felt too loud for the setting, he asked, "Is that General Evelyn Monroe?" The room fell silent. Chairs creaked, heads turned. A woman near me whispered, "Wait, that's the EM." My breath caught, but not from fear. From the sheer absurdity of it. I hadn't worn my old stars in years. But somehow, the command recognised me. Not from family, from function. The officer straightened. And then, with crisp military clarity, he raised his hand in salute. "Welcome, General." The entire hall, officers, analysts, recruits, stood, saluted. I didn't move for a full beat. The only sound was the rustle of fabric and the clink of medals brushing jackets. And then slowly, deliberately, I nodded. No speech, no step forward. I didn't need to take space. I was space. My father looked stunned, eyes wide. My mother turned blinking like she'd seen a ghost. Caleb, my brother, froze mid-applause. And in that suspended silence, I saw it hit him. Not anger, not betrayal, but recognition. Like the puzzle piece he'd always pretended was missing had just dropped into place. And the picture didn't belong to him anymore. But the applause, if you could even call it that, didn't echo in my chest the way I thought it might. It felt distant, like it was happening in a room behind glass. I stood there rigid, like the moment would shatter if I breathed too deeply. The commander's salute still hovered in the air and everyone else had followed. But what I watched wasn't the room, it was their faces. My mother's hand had flown to her chest like she needed to keep her heart from breaking in half. Her eyes welled up, not with pride, but confusion. She looked from me to Caleb like she was recalculating every memory. Caleb didn't salute. He just stood frozen, jaw-clenched eyes flickering with something close to betrayal. Not because I'd succeeded, but because I'd done it without him, without any of them. The entire room held its breath, and for a flicker of a second I almost stepped forward, almost offered a smile, a nod, a word. But then I remembered the porch light that never turned on, the locks that changed before I got to explain, and I realised I owed them nothing. The only person I'd been trying to become was already standing here. I returned the salute with a subtle tilt of my head, then turned and walked toward the exit booths, silent on the polished floor. As I passed down the aisle, whispers trailed me. That's the real EM. Why wasn't she on the programme? Did Caleb know I didn't care? Let them wonder. Let them chase the story. That was never my goal. Outside, the air hit cool and sharp. A breeze tugged at my collar, and I realised my hands were trembling, but not from nerves. From the release. A decade of silence cracked open in a single moment. No speech, no vindication, just presence. And somehow that was louder. I sat on the edge of a concrete planter near the building's side entrance out of sight, lit a match, let it flicker in the wind, then dropped it into my palm and blew it out before it could bite. It wasn't a ritual, just a reminder I still had control. Back inside, they'd moved on to the group photo. Caleb stood between our parents, stiff and smiling. My mother's arm curled gently around his back, but her gaze kept drifting to the door, to the space I'd left behind. I knew that look. She was wondering if it was too late to start over, and Caleb, his expression had that hollow tightness I remembered from childhood, whenever he realised I'd done something he couldn't undo. Not better, just different, something beyond reach. He wasn't the hero anymore, not because he didn't deserve it, but because I didn't need to be seen to stand taller. The next day, I got an envelope slid under my door, no return address. Inside a photo, black and white, grainy. It was from the ceremony, me mid-salute, the crowd behind me blurred. Someone had scribbled in the corner, finally seen. No name, just that. I burned the photo, not out of spite, but because I didn't need it. The only proof I'd ever wanted was already in the way I walked away without looking back. But the world had a way of dragging you back into frames you never posed for. Within hours, headlines were everywhere. Missing Monroe's sister, re-emerges as General, the forgotten child. Now the force behind our strongest ops. Is she a hero, or a symbol of rebellion? The stories were wild. Some painted me as a war genius, who operated from the shadows. Others speculated I'd been exiled, or even that I orchestrated the glitch to rewrite my legacy. The media didn't want nuance. They wanted narrative, and I had just given them one. They pulled out grainy photos from the ceremony, me in profile mid-salute, framed by stunned faces. Internet sleuths zoomed in, captioned my expression, made me a meme. When the black sheep becomes the general. Thanksgiving dinner's about to get awkward. I ignored it all until the call came. My father. I hadn't heard his voice since the night he shut the door on me. Now it was as rigid as ever, but with something brittle beneath it. "What have you done?" he asked. It was not a question, it was a verdict. "You've dragged our name into the dirt again. You humiliated us in front of command." That was Caleb's moment. I let the silent stretch then, answered with the same stillness I'd trained into my bones. I kept the name I said slowly to remind myself who not to become. He hung up without another word. The press kept circling. Offers came, interviews, biographies, podcasts with titles like The General They Erased. I declined all of them, not out of fear, but because I wasn't interested in trading my silence for spectacle. I didn't want applause from strangers who didn't know the cost. Instead, I got back to work. My calendar filled with operations, strategy briefings, quiet interventions overseas. I restructured a civilian rescue protocol for storm zones, helped negotiate a logistics chain to reroute aid from a corrupt intermediary. None of it made the news. That's how I liked it. But the echoes kept coming. At a coffee stand outside the Pentagon, a young analyst whispered, "Thank you." I turned. She didn't elaborate. She didn't have to. A few days later, Caleb called. I didn't pick up the first time. When I finally did, his voice was low, awkward, uncertain. I didn't know, he said. Back then, I didn't want to know. I'm sorry. I let the words hang. They didn't fix anything. But they didn't break anything either. I didn't come back for credit, I said. I came back because I never left. You just stopped seeing me. There was a long pause. I'm proud of you, he whispered, and I almost believed he meant it. I walked the city that night, coat collar pulled high, my boots echoing on the stone, at a bench across from the bus station, yes, that same one I sat for a while. Watched the buses roll in and out, watched people come and go, none of them knowing the girl who once curled up here with a duffel and no future. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a slip of paper I'd found in an old field log. On it, I scribbled, "You only need to be seen once if the seeing is real." Then folded it, tucked it under the bench, and walked away. No cameras, no applause, just me. The echo had reached its furthest point. Now it was time for the return. The text from Caleb came mid-afternoon. Brief restrained mums in the hospital. Not critical, thought you'd want to know. No invitation, no apology, just a fact. Enough. Enough to make me stand up in my apartment, step into the crisp air and begin the walk I'd been avoiding for years. The hospital lobby was familiar. Cool tiles, harsh overhead lights, distant paging announcements. I flashed, my ID said, "Only Teresa Monroe, room 217, and they looked away without judgment. As I walked the corridor, I passed the old waiting room where I'd once twirled my fingers on the armrest, while my mother read to me from picture books. The memories arrived uninvited, its musty scent, the way the window overlooked the day-lit brick courtyard where we played. I paused before room 217, hand on the doorframe. A nurse's clip chart hung there, Teresa Monroe. I inhaled smooth even. No one else was in the room. The IV drip ticked in a steady rhythm. I stepped inside. She lay in a pale hospital gown, the bedding propping her shoulders like a cradle. The fluorescence drained colour from her skin, and her hair, once thick and dark, was now the shade of spent ash. She didn't see me at first. Machines piped in soft tones, but the room was achingly quiet. I moved to the chair and sat without a sound. In books, they call it restoration of presence, but it wasn't literary, it was practical. My body existed where hers did. My breath matched the hush. Then her eyes fluttered open. They focused on me slowly, like eyes adjusting underwater. Her gaze sharpened. I saw recognition crack across her face. She whispered Evelyn. Not a question more like testing if a ghost had materialized. The name hovered between us. I nodded once beneath control, measured unmoving. She reached out a frail hand. That's enough, I thought, but I grasped her hand gently. Her skin was cold from the hospital's chill, her fingers thin like threads. I didn't withdraw. I squeezed once, steady, soft, then held. If I had known, she said, voice cracked low, I might have seen you sooner. Not, I'm sorry. Not, please, forgive me. Just confession, half-formed and uneven. I didn't reply. Not yet. because no words could bandage 15 years of silence. A kettle boiled in my memory, the church's hymn for birthdays, the rumble of the snowplough on winter mornings all choked beneath those words. My throat clenched, but my hand stayed relaxed around hers. I stood, took something from my coat, a small wrapped canvas, uncertain of how she'd receive it, but certain she needed to see it. I placed it softly on the beige bedside table. She leaned forward, unsteady eyes fixed. The painting captured her breath. A lone woman in vast desert feet, firm on pale sand under a scorching sun. Her shadow stretched long behind her, unwavering. No face, no name, just posture, resolute, unwavering. I'd done it quickly, intuitively, a sketch in muted earth tones, meant to speak what I couldn't say. She ran her eyes along that shadow, tracing the promise, I still stand. Tears glistened in her eyes, pooling but unfallen. She blinked, open-mouthed. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and moved to the door. "Don't leave," she said so quietly I almost didn't hear it. I paused, my hand on the door handle. I looked over my shoulder, waited for more, but she said nothing else, no plea, no apology, but the shimmer of vulnerability hung in the air. I closed the door quietly behind me, leaving her with the image. Then walked out into the corridor. In that moment, I felt the guest badge on my chest loosen. Not forgiveness, not acceptance, just space created in her heart. A door cracked, not opened. Outside, the afternoon sun slanted through windows. I leaned against the cool wall, breathing slowly. Later, I found a bench in the courtyard. Trees stood bare, leaves bruised in full colour. I closed my eyes and let a single memory surface, the birthday mornings, when my mother baked cinnamon rolls and placed a ribbon in my hair. I was 7, choosing the one she'd made. I'd asked her once why she always wore a smile, even when Dad was stern. She told me, because the world deserves kindness, even when your own hands feel full. I felt those words now as heartbreak and hope. My phone buzzed an update from Caleb with 12-hour shift. I'll check in when I can. No invitation. But it was enough. I tacked back toward the hospital's entrance, the canvas still tucked carefully under my arm, like a compass pointing north. On the way out, I saw Mum's curtain pulled aside. She watched me go. I didn't turn, I didn't wave, just kept walking. The corridor lights faded behind me as I stepped outside, into dusk, lungs filling with cool air and possibility. This return wasn't a homecoming. It was a thread thin, but real, linking someone I'd been to someone I might still be. I didn't sit for reconciliation. I don't think I wanted it. I wanted acknowledgement to exist, and I got that. Now the next step looms. Something formal, something familial. A dinner, a request, a crossroads, where they trade old wounds for fragile diplomacy. But that moment will wait until I shape it on my terms. Turns out, the moment didn't wait long. 3 days after I left the hospital, an envelope arrived. Not email, not text, but a real envelope. Handwritten. Caleb's writing. The curves too careful to be casual. Inside, a folded card with our family crest, embossed faintly on the corner. Not military. Church. The kind they'd used for holiday cards, back when Mum still made cider from scratch, and we posed in matching sweaters for photos that never quite looked as happy as they were meant to. Dinner at 7, it read. Everyone will be there. Seats saved. C. No explanation, no plea, just an invitation draped in nostalgia and dripped with something else. Obligation, maybe, or strategy. I thought about ignoring it, about returning to my quiet rotation of shelters and supply reports, letting the silence remain intact. But curiosity is a stubborn ghost. It taps your shoulder when you least expect it, and sometimes it looks like an invitation scrawled in gilt. When I arrived, the house looked the same. The porch light flickered faintly. The same ceramic planter cracked at the base, but the air held something, forced, like a scene reset too perfectly. Inside the dining room table had been extended linen-draped candles lit. Silverware I hadn't seen since my graduation dinner. My old chair, once squeaky splintered, was reupholstered in soft tan leather. I ran my hand over the back of it. The stitching was tight, precise, like someone had tried too hard to erase the memory of its brokenness. Caleb stood near the far end, hands clasped behind his back. He offered a nod, not quite warm, not quite cold. Mum was in the kitchen arranging salad with the kind of nervous perfection that says everything's normal, even when it's not. Dad was already seated, posture, exact glass of water untouched. "Thanks for coming," Caleb said. I sat without responding. The candlelight flickered between us like it was holding breath. Dishes were passed. Roast beef, green beans, mashed potatoes, comfort food dressed up in civility. No one mentioned the decade I'd missed. No one acknowledged the weight in the room. For 10 minutes we chewed in choreographed silence. Then, Dad cleared his throat. "We're glad you're here," he said, voice too formal. "It means a lot to your mother." I didn't look at him. I looked at her. She nodded once, lips thin. "I imagine you didn't call me for the mashed potatoes," I said finally. Fork still in hand. Caleb's jaw tightened. He placed his napkin on the table, folded carefully. "There's something we need to discuss." Of course there was. He leaned forward. "It's about an inquiry. There's a file. My name's in it, but only on the edges. Someone's been digging. Logistics trail from my last deployment, wrong contractor flagged, but optics are bad. I need it reviewed. Quietly." I waited. Dad spoke next. "We thought, given your position, your influence, you might be able to expedite clarity. Before it spreads. Before it spreads. Not before it wounds. Not before it harms. Just before it embarrasses." I put down my fork. The weight of the room shifted. "If I weren't a general," I said slowly, "would I even be your daughter?" The silence that followed was heavier than any accusation. It pressed against the walls. Mum dropped her eyes to her plate. Caleb shifted in his seat. My father didn't move at all. I wasn't expecting an answer. Not really. But the lack of one still burned. "I'm not here because I owe you." I added, tone low but steady. "I'm here because I needed to see if anything had changed." I let that sit, then continued, "I will review the file. Not for you, for the people it might affect if this spirals. But I won't clean your conscience, and I won't forget." I pushed back my chair. The newly upholstered leather creaked under the strain, still not fully settled like the lie it carried. Mum whispered, "Thank you." I didn't acknowledge it. At the door, I paused just long enough to glance over my shoulder. Caleb was looking down, fingers pressed together, like prayer. But prayers don't mean much when the gods are the ones you cast out. Outside, the night had turned cold. I pulled my coat tighter and walked into the dark boots, echoing against the pavement like punctuation marks. I thought that would be the end of it, a dinner, cloaked as reconciliation, a question posed in truth and silence as my answer. But silence doesn't always stay buried. A week later, my past surfaced again, this time not in whispers, but in headlines. They started small tucked between defense updates and gossip columns, General Monroe's disappearing years. What was she hiding? Then came the deeper digs. Blog posts turned to opinion pieces. Tabloids unearthed old photos me in a diner apron, eyes red from exhaustion, hair hacked unevenly in that cheap motel mirror. They captioned it like an exposé from gas station to general scandal or survival. The photo from the bus station resurfaced too, knees tucked back hunched, a girl erased by her own bloodline. They speculated wildly, was I unstable? Was I running from dishonour? Had the military overlooked a liability for the sake of a comeback story? I didn't flinch. I didn't explain. Because when you've rebuilt yourself from ashes, you stop fearing fire. The media wanted spectacle. I gave them legislation. 3 weeks later, I filed the framework for the Service Transparency Act. No press conference, no sponsor gala, just a quiet release from my office, anonymously drafted, but unmistakably mine. It wasn't about vindication. It was about creating a shield for those like me, people whose names had been turned into weapons by the very institutions that should have protected them. The Act did not mention me. It didn't need to. But every clause held my fingerprint. It proposed full protections for service members whose family institution or identity had been used as grounds for dismissal silencing or professional sabotage. It required transparency in internal investigations, not for the sake of punishment, but for healing. It offered legal shielding for whistleblowers' identity claimants and survivors of organisational erasure, and at the very top, bolded but unadorned, was its mission statement. Family should not be a muzzle. That line travelled faster than any headline they wrote about me. It appeared on bumper stickers, office corkboards, even a graffiti mural outside a veterans shelter in New Jersey. Survivors wrote letters, not fans, survivors. A woman named Rena, who lost custody after reporting her commanding officer. A non-binary medic dishonourably discharged after coming out. A father whose own son had filed against him in retaliation. They called me General Quiet, the ghost advocate, the one who doesn't knock, just enters through truth. Still, my inbox flooded with slander. Traitor to tradition, weaponizing victimhood. You're ruining the sanctity of service. I didn't respond. My hands were full with something more sacred, rebuilding trust in systems that never trusted us first. One night, while reviewing amendment drafts, I found a handwritten envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a photo one I'd never seen before, not from the media. This one was real. I was in profile, standing by the window of a command tent during the desert operation. The photo caught me in mid-brief lips, parted fingers, hovering above a map light, slanting across my face like a crosshatch. On the back, someone had scrawled in black ink, "You lead without needing to be followed." No name. Just that. I kept it. Not for vanity, but as proof that someone had seen what the stories tried to distort. In the months that followed, the Act moved faster than expected. Congress debated, cable panels speculated, but the people, especially the silent ones, rose behind it like a tide. By fall, it passed with a majority no one predicted. And still, I made no public comment. I didn't need a podium. My message had already spoken itself. That winter, I gave a closed-door briefing to the Office of Military Ethics. Not a testimony, just a guided tour through the architecture of shame and how to dismantle it. When I left, one junior officer shook my hand and said, "Your silence is the most articulate thing I've ever seen." I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I finally understood something I hadn't before. My strength wasn't in the battles I won. It was in the wars I refused to fight on their terms. I never asked for their applause, only that they stop clapping for the wrong people. Then Caleb showed up. Not on a holiday, not after press conferences or public controversies. Just a grey, ordinary Tuesday, the sort that resumes without fanfare. I remember the moment clearly. I'd been cleaning my kitchen, wiping down the counter where I framed the first print of the Service Transparency Act when the knock came. Mid-swab. I froze. My stomach tightened. Who would knock? When I opened the door, there he was. Same storm grey coat I remembered from childhood winters. The one we used to laugh about, matching Dad's uniform jackets. Only now, the coat looked too big for him, like he was trying to step into someone else's story. He didn't hold flowers or explain himself, just stood there hesitating like he wasn't sure if he was allowed in. I stepped aside. It was my quiet way of saying, "Come." He walked in, eyes skimming the sparse walls, the framed actor desert painting I'd carried through deployments, a single photograph of a crew I'd worked with overseas. He settled at the kitchen table, the same one where I once tried to keep our family together by sharing hopes between plates of rice and chicken. Now it held only empty mugs and the weight of years. "Is this where you actually live now?" he asked, voice low. His question wasn't curious. It was searching. "Why?" I asked. He swallowed back stiff with something he couldn't hide. "You ever think you'd come back?" He met my gaze. To us, I studied his face, the tension around his jaw, the honest weariness in his eyes. Breaking silence felt like shifting tectonic plates. I said, "I live where I belong. No invitation, but not a rejection either." He exhaled, "This act. It's big. Service Transparency Act. You passed it." I nodded. "It became law. It's not small." He tapped the framed paper. "Kids in boot camp are learning it. Commanders are changing protocols. It's on people's phones." When he looked at me again, I recognized that familiar ache, that moment suspended between pride and abandonment. He whispered, "I've read it," more than once. And he locked eyes for a breath. I never realized how wrong we were for everything, for not hearing you. He lowered his gaze. I thought I was loyal. I thought silence meant support. But silence wasn't support. He shook his head. "No." His voice cracked soft, genuine. It was the opposite. Tears filled his eyes, but he didn't turn away. He said, "I've wanted to say this a long time. I'm sorry for never asking, for letting you walk away alone." He blinked as if surprised by his own confession. I sat still. My body felt steady, but my mind raced. This was the moment we'd never had the moment, where roles reversed. I could say so much. I could break him with words he deserves. But I didn't. Instead, I said softly, "You didn't erase me, Caleb. You just forgot I was becoming something. And when people forget, they write over you like a rough draft." He winced as if struck exposed. The room was quiet. You could hear the hum of the refrigerator, distant traffic, a faint chime at the neighbour's door. "It's true." He exhaled slowly, pain coating each word. Back then, I was proud, chasing Dad's approval, following the rules. But when you stood silent, broke away, it looked like betrayal. And I couldn't risk that. Instead of asking you, I just stood with them. "I know." I closed my eyes. "You were afraid. Afraid of what," he asked, voice soft. "Afraid of what would happen if you spoke the truth." He blinked. I was. He swallowed hard. "I'm still scared. But maybe less." A tear rolled down his cheek. I didn't come to ask for anything. Relief and grief crashed together inside me. I didn't need him to ask forgiveness. I just needed him to arrive. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said, "but I want you to know I see you. I know who you are now." My throat tightened, not from emotion, but from recognition that we finally spoke across the gulf we built. Not because we've erased it, but because we can now name it. He stood pacing, fighting between past and future. Then he reached out, hand trembling. His voice stopped. He paused. "Can we start?" I closed my eyes. I wanted to say yes, but would start be enough? When I opened them, I simply met his hand with mine, silently. A touch, not swept, with forgiveness, but acceptance. He paused, looking down on us. "I'll learn. I will." "Good," I replied, voice steady. "Because I'm still here." He nodded and stepped back. A solemn promise hung between us. Later, after he left, I found a note in the kitchen. "I'll always be your brother. No name, no date." I folded it and slipped it into the axe frame behind the glass, there where his words could linger but not define me. The day of the national conference arrived on a crisp winter morning. The Grand Hall felt charged, a gathering of service members, policymakers, veterans and journalists, all assembled under one roof to reckon with what duty and truth could mean in the 21st century military. I stepped onto the stage, dressed simply in a charcoal pantsuit, no medals pinned, no ceremonial sash, only a single microphone and a slideshow screen behind me, displaying the title Public Kinship Act, Restoring Trust Where Family Overlaps Authority. I began softly. The most powerful relationships in our lives, those of blood, should never be the most dangerous. My voice carried into the hush. I scanned the crowd halfway back. I caught sight of Caleb's face, eyes steady, expression open, and a few rows ahead, officers who once turned their backs now leaning forward. I carried on telling the story of a young strategist whose identity had been erased by her father's silence, whose return drove not scandal, but accountability. The Public Kinship Act proposed a new layer of transparency, mandatory declaration of any close blood or legal relationship when involved in official decisions. Promotion boards, court-martials, procurement, and establishing an oversight office to shield whistleblowers from family-based pressure. I laid out real cases, hidden nepotism, whispered threats, unspoken conflicts. This wasn't about scandal, it was about protecting the integrity of service and the rights of individuals caught between personal loyalty and public duty. When I spoke my closing line, the hall was silent. Family should not muzzle duty. Family should not shield bias. Family should never threaten truth. Then, almost as afterthought, I don't need to be remembered. I just need to be real. The applause came first hesitant, then building. But I didn't dwell. I stepped off the stage and into a quiet corridor. No press scrum, no talking heads. I stepped outside into heavy snowflakes, drifting past the conference centre lights. My boots crunched through powder as I walked, no entourage, no security detail. This was the moment I'd been building toward, untethered, visible only as myself, defined not by my name or my lineage, but by what I chose to live for. Snow settled on my shoulders, a simple reminder that even the softest burden can collect weight if you stop moving. I took a deep breath and looked up at the dark sky, and I whispered to myself, not to anyone else, I don't need to be remembered. I just need to be real. Snow settled on my shoulders like the memory of hands that once pushed me away. But this time, I didn't flinch. I kept walking because peace isn't always a place. Sometimes it's the sound of your own footsteps in the quiet, unchased, unjudged, finally your own. If you've ever been cast aside by the people who are supposed to know you best, if you've ever had to rebuild yourself in silence from ashes no one thought to honour, I hope this story reminds you your worth is not up for a vote. You don't need to be remembered to matter. You just need to be real. And if this story stayed with you, if it made something ache in your chest, or sparked something new in your spirit, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Drop your own story in the comments. Someone out there might need to hear it too. And if you'd like more stories like this, quiet but powerful, aching but true, hit subscribe. There's more where this came from. Because sometimes the loudest truth is the one spoken with your whole life.